Okay, so you want to own a fast food restaurant. Not work at one. Own one. Golden arches on the sign, your name on the deed, a drive-through line that never stops moving. You've done the math on a napkin. Burgers cost cents to make and sell for dollars. Multiply that by a few hundred cars a day, and retirement looks close. Here's the sentence that changes the picture. In 1960, McDonald's financial advisor Harry Sonneborn stood in front of Wall Street investors and said the quiet part out loud. We are not technically in the food business. We are in the real estate business. The only reason we sell 15-cent hamburgers is because they are the greatest producer of revenue from which our tenants can pay us rent. Sonneborn wasn't joking. He wasn't being clever for a headline. He was describing, in one sentence, the actual architecture of the industry you're about to enter. You think you're buying a burger business. You are, in most cases, applying to become a tenant, a very carefully monitored, contractually obligated tenant, inside a real estate company that happens to also sell food. Think about what that means for a second. This is a man whose entire job was raising capital for a hamburger chain, standing in front of the people writing the checks and telling them, essentially, don't evaluate us on burger margins. Evaluate us on rent rolls. He wasn't selling franchisees on a food concept. He was selling investors on a property portfolio that happened to have a drive-thru attached. That single reframe, food as the delivery mechanism, real estate as the actual product, is the reason a company that sells items priced in single dollars can be worth tens of billions. It's the reason the industry has produced more billionaires from owning land under restaurants than from flipping the burgers on top of it. And it's the reason the paperwork you're about to sign, if you go through with this, looks less like a small business startup kit and more like a commercial lease with a logo stapled to the front page. And once you understand that, every other number in this video starts to make sense. Let's start with what the sign tells you versus what the paperwork tells you. The sign says McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's. A logo, a mascot, a jingle you've had stuck in your head since you were 9 years old. The illusion is that when you buy in, you're buying a business that sells food to people who are hungry. The reality is closer to this. You are buying the right to operate, for a fixed number of years, inside a system where almost every physical and financial lever is held by someone else. Take the biggest name in the category. By the end of 2024, roughly 95% of McDonald's restaurants worldwide were franchised, run by independent operators, not the corporation. That number used to be closer to 85% in the mid-2000s. The company didn't shrink. It restructured. It sold off the labor-intensive, lower-margin job of flipping burgers, and it kept something far more valuable underneath. McDonald's owns approximately 45% of the land its restaurants sit on, and roughly 70% of the buildings. Some estimates for its most mature, consolidated markets put building ownership closer to 80%. On the remaining sites, the company leases the land from an outside landlord, then subleases it to you at a markup. Either way, McDonald's sits between you and the ground your restaurant is built on. This is not unique to McDonald's. It is, with variations, the model underneath Burger King's parent restaurant Brands International, underneath Wendy's, underneath most of the publicly traded quick-service giants. The franchisor controls the site. The franchisee operates the box. Zoom out to the scale of the category, and the illusion gets harder to see, precisely because it's everywhere. Fast food and quick-service restaurants operate tens of thousands of locations across the United States alone, the overwhelming majority of them independently owned and financed by someone who signed a franchise agreement believing they were buying a business. Almost none of them are buying the ground underneath it. And here's the part that should reframe how you think about the entire category. Not every fast food company runs this way. Chick-fil-A does the opposite. Chick-fil-A corporate buys the land, builds the restaurant, owns the real estate outright, and then asks a new operator for an initial investment of around $10,000, not the 7 figures you're about to see from everyone else. Same industry, same drive-thru, completely different ownership of the asset underneath it. This wasn't always the plan. In the earliest days of McDonald's, Ray Kroc, the man most people credit with building the empire, was running a more conventional franchise business. Sell the right to use the name, sell the equipment and supplies, collect a modest royalty, move on to the next city. It was Sonneborn, not Kroc, who looked at that model and decided it left too much value on the table. If McDonald's controlled the real estate instead of just the recipe, it could set rent terms, enforce operating standards through the threat of eviction rather than just a franchise agreement, and, critically, capture the rising value of well-located commercial land as the chain expanded into thousands of towns before land prices caught up. Kroc reportedly disliked how bluntly Sonneborn described it to investors. He didn't disagree with the arithmetic. That same architecture now sits underneath most of the publicly traded quick-service names you'd recognize on site. Restaurant Brands International, the parent company of Burger King, Tim Hortons, and Popeyes, runs a similar franchise and property structure, though with a smaller owned real estate footprint than McDonald's. Wendy's leases and subleases sites to its operators in comparable fashion. The specific percentages differ brand to brand, sometimes site to site within the same brand, but the shape of the deal repeats itself across the industry. The franchisor keeps the appreciating asset, the franchisee keeps the depreciating equipment and the daily grind of running it. So before you sign anything, the first question isn't, how good is the food? It's, who owns the dirt? And as you're about to see, the answer to that question determines almost everything else that happens to you financially for the next 20 years. Let's build the actual cost stack, layer by layer, the way it appears in a real franchise disclosure document. Layer 1, the initial franchise fee. For McDonald's, this typically runs $45,000 to $50,000, paid up front, simply for the right to be considered and trained. It buys you nothing physical. No building, no equipment, no land. It buys you a seat at the table. Layer 2, the build-out. Land acquisition or lease, construction, kitchen equipment, signage, point-of-sale systems, initial inventory. For a traditional new McDonald's restaurant, total investment, fee included, runs from roughly $1.5 million to $2.7 million, depending on the market and whether you're building new or converting an existing site. Layer 3, proof you can survive your own restaurant before it turns a profit. Franchisors typically require several $100,000 in non-borrowed personal liquidity, money that isn't itself a loan, just to be approved. This isn't a cost you pay the company. It's a cost of admission that keeps undercapitalized operators out, in theory. In practice, it keeps most people out entirely. All of this is written down, in detail, in a document every prospective franchisee is legally entitled to receive before signing anything. The Franchise Disclosure Document, or FDD. It runs to hundreds of pages, split into numbered items covering fees, litigation history, financial performance, and termination rights. Item 20 lists how many franchised units opened, closed, transferred, or were terminated in the past 3 years, the closest thing this industry has to a public failure rate. Almost every number in this video exists somewhere inside a document like that one. The information was never hidden. It was simply buried in a format designed to be signed, not read. Now here's where the layers start stacking on top of each other, every single month, for the life of the agreement. A royalty, calculated as a percentage of your gross sales. Not your profit, your gross sales. Currently around 4% on existing McDonald's restaurants, rising to 5% on new locations opened since the start of 2024. You pay this whether you had a good month or a terrible one. An advertising contribution, typically another 4% of gross sales, funding national marketing campaigns you have no control over and did not vote on. And then the one most new operators underestimate: rent. Not the flat, predictable rent of a normal commercial tenant. Percentage rent, a base amount plus a variable share of your sales, typically landing somewhere between 8.5% and 15% of gross revenue, depending on the location and lease vintage. Royalty, advertising, rent. Stack them, and a McDonald's franchisee is routing somewhere between 15% and 20% of every single dollar that crosses the counter back to the franchisor, before paying for beef, buns, labor, electricity, or a single broken ice cream machine. 15 to 20% of gross revenue. That's the number. Say it stays exactly there for the life of the lease. It doesn't. Rent usually only moves in one direction, and you still haven't paid a single employee yet. Now put a real store behind those percentages, because abstract numbers hide how fast this adds up. Average annual sales at a traditional McDonald's location run somewhere near $3.6 million. Run the stacked percentages against that figure, and a franchisee is sending roughly $680,000 to $788,000 back to the franchisor every single year in fees, advertising, and rent combined, before a single burger patty, a single wage, a single utility bill gets paid out of what's left. That's not the cost of one bad year. That's the baseline cost of every year for 20 years, win or lose. And the fee stack keeps escalating the newer and larger the format gets. A satellite location inside a gas station or a mall food court might carry a smaller footprint and a lower build-out cost. A standalone restaurant with a double drive-thru, built new from raw land, sits at the top end of that $2.7 million range. A remodel forced by the franchisor's periodic image upgrade requirements, new signage, new dining room, new equipment, mandated on a cycle you don't control, adds another six-figure obligation on top of a location that's already open and already paying rent. First the fee, then the build-out, then the remodel you didn't ask for. Each layer arrives after you thought you were done paying to get in the door. Compare the two ends of the spectrum sitting inside the same industry. On one end, Chick-fil-A, roughly $10,000 to start because the company owns the real estate and simply installs an operator. On the other end, a traditional McDonald's, Burger King, or Wendy's rebuild, over $1 million in, plus a fifth of every dollar out, for 20 years, before you've bought a single potato. So if the franchisee is carrying that much weight, where does the money actually land? And why does the franchisor barely feel the risk? Look at McDonald's own numbers. In 2023, the company reported $25.49 billion in total revenue. Of that, $15.4 billion came from franchised restaurants, royalties, and rent combined, representing roughly 64% of total revenue. Inside that franchise revenue, rent alone made up about 64% of the figure, with royalties making up the remaining 36%. Restate that because it's the whole episode in one line. At a company that sells more hamburgers than any other business on earth, the single largest revenue category is rent. Now compare margins, not just revenue, because this is where the model actually proves itself. The franchise side of McDonald's business runs at operating margins around 40%. The company-operated restaurants, the ones McDonald's runs itself, absorbing food costs, labor, spoilage, and slow Tuesdays, run at operating margins closer to 15% to 18%. Same brand, same menu, same fryers. A 40% margin on one side of the wall, an 18% margin on the other. The difference isn't the burgers. The difference is who's exposed to the cost of making them. And there's a second engineering choice buried in the lease structure that matters just as much as the percentage itself. Rent here isn't fixed. It's tied to your sales, which means when inflation pushes menu prices up or a location simply sells more food, the franchisor's rent check gets larger automatically. No renegotiation, no new lease, no conversation required. A landlord charging a flat dollar amount in 1970 would be collecting 1970-sized rent today. A landlord charging a percentage of sales has been quietly riding inflation and growth for over 50 years without lifting a finger. While the franchisee is absorbing rising beef prices, rising wages, and rising insurance costs out of a shrinking margin, the franchisor is collecting a larger rent check off the exact same rising prices from the safety of a roll that never has to flip a single burger. That asymmetry is not a side effect of the business. It is the business. And it explains something that confuses a lot of people looking at this industry from the outside. Franchisors can survive, even thrive, during periods when large numbers of their own franchisees are struggling or closing. The rent and royalty structure means the franchisor gets paid off gross sales at the store level long before anyone gets to the franchisee's bottom line. A location can be barely profitable or not profitable at all for its actual operator, and still be a fully profitable tenant relationship for the company that owns the real estate underneath it. Walk the order of operations for a single location, and the priority becomes visible. Gross sales come in first. Rent and royalty are calculated and owed against that top-line number immediately, regardless of what happens next. Only after that fixed claim is satisfied does the franchisee start paying food cost, labor, insurance, utilities, and equipment maintenance out of what remains. Whatever survives that entire sequence is the franchisee's actual take-home. The number they were picturing on the napkin at the start of this video, except now it's sitting at the very back of the line, behind a landlord and a licensor who both got paid the moment the register opened that morning. This is why McDonald's, as a corporation, can report record annual revenue during the exact same years that individual franchisees are describing labor costs, beef prices, and rent as unsustainable. Both statements can be true simultaneously. They're describing two different financial systems that happen to share a logo. It also explains why McDonald's balance sheet reads more like a real estate investment trust than a restaurant company. Roughly 60% of the company's total assets, before depreciation, sit in land and buildings, not in inventory, not in cash, not in equipment. Wall Street analysts covering the stock routinely describe it as one of the largest single-tenant net lease property portfolios on the planet, one that happens to also run a burger counter on top of every parcel. The comparison isn't a metaphor. It's closer to a literal description of where the balance sheet's value actually sits. Here's what happens when that pressure finally breaks something. Not a single small franchisee, but the largest one in the entire system. NPC International wasn't a mom-and-pop operator. Founded in 1962, based first in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and later Overland Park, it grew, over decades, into the single largest Pizza Hut franchisee in the United States, and the largest Wendy's franchisee too. By 2020, NPC operated 1,227 Pizza Hut restaurants, roughly 16 to 20% of the entire U.S. Pizza Hut system, plus 385 to 393 Wendy's locations. Nearly 40,000 employees, 27 states. This was not a company that misunderstood the business. This was the business at its largest and most sophisticated scale, and it still collapsed under the weight of the exact structure we just walked through. By early 2020, NPC was carrying close to $903 million in debt. On January 31st, it missed an interest payment. Moody's and S&P downgraded its debt further into junk territory that February. The company warned lenders it would run out of working capital by late January if nothing changed, and secured $35 million in emergency financing just to keep operating through the following months. Then came the pandemic, not the cause of the collapse, but the final push against a structure that was already leaning. On July 1st, 2020, NPC International filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the Southern District of Texas. In its own bankruptcy filing, NPC listed its two largest creditors as Pizza Hut and Wendy's. The franchisors it had been paying rent and royalties to for decades were now first in line to be repaid before anyone else. Cowen analyst Andrew Charles estimated at the time that Pizza Hut's parent company, Yum! Brands, stood to lose up to $54.2 million in annualized royalty revenue from the filing alone, a number large enough to move headlines, and still only a fraction of what NPC itself was carrying. NPC's own account of its decline named years of deteriorating brand image, a crowded pizza market, and reluctance from the Pizza Hut franchisor to invest in updating the brand. In other words, NPC believed part of its collapse was caused by decisions made above its head, by the very system it was contractually required to keep paying rent and royalties to, whether the brand was working or not. The pizza kept coming out of the ovens. The stores kept opening every morning through the entire bankruptcy process. What changed wasn't the food. It was who owned NPC's restaurants and who got paid first once the money ran out. Much of that $903 million in debt traced back to a 2018 leverage buyout, when NPC was sold to a group of family offices and took on significant new borrowing to finance the transaction. The kind of financial engineering that has nothing to do with how well a Pizza Hut sells pizza and everything to do with how a company is owned on paper. Layer that debt load on top of an already thin rent and royalty margin, and the operator had almost no room left to absorb a bad year. Then the pandemic arrived, and there was no room left at all. By January 2021, a bankruptcy court approved the resolution, an $801 million sale of NPC's restaurants, split mainly between Flynn Restaurant Group, already the largest restaurant franchisee in the United States, and a handful of existing Wendy's operators. Flynn alone picked up more than 925 Pizza Hut locations and roughly 200 Wendy's units, instantly becoming Pizza Hut's largest single operator and pushing its own footprint past 2,300 restaurants and $3.5 billion in annual system-wide sales. It remains, as of this filing, the largest franchisee-to-franchisee acquisition in U.S. restaurant history. Notice what didn't happen anywhere in that sequence. Pizza Hut, the franchisor, was never at risk of disappearing. Wendy's, the franchisor, was never at risk of disappearing. The brand didn't file for bankruptcy. The building didn't file for bankruptcy. The tenant did. And when the tenant collapsed under its own debt and thin margins, the restaurants themselves didn't go dark. They simply changed hands to another operator willing to sign the same lease terms and try again. And NPC wasn't an isolated case study of one bad operator making bad decisions. Look at Quiznos, a sandwich chain that once operated roughly 5,000 locations. Franchisees there were contractually required to buy ingredients through a franchisor-controlled supply arrangement, often at prices well above market. Margins collapsed store by store. SBA loan data later put Quiznos' franchise loan default rate at over 42%, nearly 1 in every 2 financed franchisees failing to repay their loan. 2 very different failure mechanisms, one a real estate and royalty structure, one a mandatory supply chain. Arriving at the same destination, the operator absorbs the downside, and the system built above them keeps collecting. Across the wider industry, the data tells a consistent story even without a single dramatic bankruptcy. Small Business Administration loan figures for franchise financing show average default rates hovering around 10% across all franchise categories between 2010 and 2021, with some individual food service brands running above 20% and a small number, like Quiznos, running above 40%. The industry-wide marketing claim of a 90% franchise success rate is not supported by that lending data. It never was. So who actually wins in this structure? And why does the answer barely change, year after year, brand after brand? The franchisor wins by never fully carrying the operational risk it appears, on the surface, to be sharing. It collects a franchise fee up front, before a single burger is sold. It collects royalties on gross sales, insulated from the franchisee's actual profit margin. And where it holds the real estate, it collects rent that rises automatically with inflation and sales growth, structurally positioned as one of the first creditors paid if the relationship ever ends in bankruptcy court. The franchisee, meanwhile, carries almost the entire operating risk, the labor costs, the food costs, the maintenance, the local competition, the slow Tuesday afternoons, the year gas prices spike and drive-thru traffic quietly drops. They also carry something less visible, but arguably more important, the capital risk. Most of the 7-figure investment is financed with debt, typically an SBA loan, personally guaranteed. If the location fails, the debt doesn't disappear with the restaurant. It follows the person who signed for it. While the franchisee is betting a house, a retirement account, and often years of unpaid labor on a single location's local performance. The franchisor is running the same rent and royalty math across tens of thousands of locations simultaneously, so that a few thousand struggling stores barely register against the system-wide total. This is not a conspiracy. It's not hidden. It's disclosed, in detail, in every franchise disclosure document a franchisee signs before opening. The information is available. The imbalance is not a secret. It's a documented, negotiated, and heavily lawyered structure that both sides enter with their eyes open. But disclosed and understood at the moment of signing are 2 very different things. Most new franchisees are evaluating a dream: financial independence, being their own boss, building something with their name on the lease, not modeling out 20 years of percentage rent against a menu of rising commodity costs. The lease you sign on day 1 isn't just a real estate document. It's the actual mechanism of the entire industry, compressed into a single page of numbers most people skim past to get to the signature line. And the scale gap between the 2 sides is worth sitting with for a moment. A single franchisee, even a large multi-unit operator running dozens of restaurants, is exposed to local rent, local labor markets, local competition, and local consumer habits, variables that can turn against one operator while the rest of the system is doing fine. The franchisor is diversified across every one of those local variables simultaneously, collecting a percentage from thousands of geographically and economically unrelated locations at once. If 100 stores in one region have a rough year, the system-wide royalty and rent totals barely move. The individual operator doesn't have that luxury. Their entire financial life is concentrated in the handful of addresses on their franchise agreements. There is a broader pattern sitting underneath the McDonald-specific numbers, too. Small Business Administration lending data shows default rates on franchise loans clustering between 5% and 15% for well-run systems, and climbing above 20%, sometimes above 40%, for weaker ones, with brand-new franchise systems under 5 years old showing consistently higher failure rates than established ones. Franchisors are not required to publish an industry-wide failure rate, and the commonly repeated marketing claim of a 90% success rate has no rigorous study behind it. What does exist? SBA default data and disclosure documents most prospective franchisees never fully read points the same direction, brand after brand. The franchisor's revenue is close to guaranteed by contract. The franchisee's is not. Go back to Sonneborn's sentence, because it was never really about hamburgers. We are not in the food business. We are in the real estate business. Swap out 15-cent hamburgers for whatever product sits on top of the lease in front of you. Coffee, sandwiches, gym memberships, hotel rooms, and the sentence still holds. The product is rarely where the real profit lies. The real profit lives underneath it, in who owns the asset, who controls the term, and who gets paid first when the arrangement breaks. None of this makes fast food franchising a scam. Thousands of operators run profitable, multi-decade businesses inside this exact structure, some of them building real wealth across several locations and passing them down to their own children. The system works for the people who go and capitalized, who understand the fee stack before they sign, and who treat the franchise disclosure document as required reading rather than a formality on the way to a ribbon cutting. The system also fails a predictable percentage of people every single year, by design as much as by accident, and the SBA default data has been telling that story for over a decade to anyone willing to read it instead of the brochure. So the next time you see a franchise being sold as a path to financial freedom, a turnkey business, a proven system, a brand people already trust, ask the only question that actually determines the outcome. Are you buying a business? Or are you signing a 20-year lease with a logo attached to it?